Ladies and gents, welcome back. I trust everyone had a great Easter long weekend. Another thing happened over the weekend, and that was that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, well, would have turned 40 years old if it was still a document that had any weight in Canada in protecting its citizens, the reason why the Charter exists. Now, the Charter has been under attack for the past 2 years at least. In our recent times, we've seen travel restrictions and restrictions of people's religious freedoms, restrictions on bodily autonomy as well. Now, I took to Twitter to say the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms would have turned 40 today if Justin Trudeau hadn't destroyed its ability to protect peaceful citizens. Of course, I was referring to the fact that the Emergencies Act was declared on a peaceful bunch of protesters in Ottawa, and that will go down in infamy. But now, many members of Parliament taking to Twitter to talk about their appreciation for the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have here Bardish Chagger. For the past 40 years, our charter helped build a country, Canada, build a flag where people from all over the world can come together as equals to create opportunities for one another. Its spirit is at the heart of Canada's success and inspires us all to work toward a fairer, more just society. A more just society. Now, this particular member of Parliament, we'll keep that name in mind. We have here, how did your MP vote in the Emergencies Act debate? Now, people, of course, wanted to keep track of this, and I'll leave a link in the description down below so you can check on your MP and see exactly how they voted. I know my MP voted for the Emergencies Act, which, of course, I'll be bringing that to the polls next time with me, and I'll be encouraging other people in my region to be going to the polls with that in mind. But we have here, of course, Bardish Chagger from Liberal Party in Waterloo, Ontario, voting yay for the suspension of liberties in an emergency that Justin Trudeau declared over peaceful protesters that had literally had bouncy castles in the streets of Ottawa, where people were celebrating their freedom and protesting against unlawful overreach by the government. Who else do we have here? We have David Lametti. I'll never forget what it felt like watching an adoption of a Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms 40 years ago. He was around for it. Hey, he can remember what it was like, the adoption. Today, 40 years later, I'm reflecting on the profound impact that the Charter has had protecting the fundamental rights and freedoms of every single Canadian. He didn't think of that back when they were voting on the Emergencies Act. Here's David Lametti, Liberal from LaSalle, Emard Verdun, voting yay for the Emergencies Act against peaceful citizens assembling in Ottawa. Also, people had their accounts frozen who were never, ever charged afterwards with any crimes under this Emergencies Act. We also have Mark Gerritsen. 40 years ago today, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was signed and entrenched into Canadian Constitution, guaranteeing certain political and civil rights to all Canadian citizens, except when it's politically not expedient. Here he is voting yay. We also have Yassir Naqvi. I did not live in Canada 40 years ago, but the Charter has very much defined my identity as a Canadian. To me, it's a perfect document with its imperfections, such as the notwithstanding clause. Oh, maybe that comes into play here. Let's start the work to renew it to reflect the country of today and tomorrow. Okay. But he voted with that notwithstanding clause in voting for yay to suspend the Constitution, suspend the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in the Constitution for citizens in Canada. Who have we here? Seamus O'Regan Jr. Junior, 40 years ago today, watching the news. As a kid, my dad told me how important the charter would be. I'm sure he took that to his profession. Did he? Did he? An imperfect attempt to balance freedom with justice and equality. We are a country that never claims to be better, just keeps trying to do better. The charter lights our way. How much did he do better? Well, Shameful O'Regan voted yay for the suspension of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms against people who have been found by a judge to have been protesting in a legal way. They did not commit any crimes except trumped up charges of mischief and whatnot. So, of course, the Supreme Leader, Justin Trudeau, jumping in here with a few strokes of a pen 40 years ago and a few strokes of a pen removing it, obviously, in recent history. Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms was adopted, built around our shared values of equality, justice, and freedom. It protects the rights and freedoms that define who we are as Canadians and brings us closer as a country. I loved how Viva Fry immediately took to Twitter to quote tweet him saying, "Can you believe Justin Trudeau is actually virtue signal tweeting the 40-year anniversary of the Charter of Rights? He spent the last 2 years desecrating, just absolutely destroying. We will never forget, or we'll never let Trudeau and all the members of the federal government forget what they did to their own people." I can't agree more. Just unbelievable. Now, we had a article from the National Post here saying the charter that defines rights, but also tells governments how to quash them. And this is where we get into that notwithstanding clause. Everyone is inclined to cheer the charter as a bulwark of liberty. We are less free today than 40 years ago, says John Capre, president of the Justice Center of Constitutional Freedoms. Earlier this year, the Supreme Court of the U.S. quashed any attempt by President Joe Biden to establish vaccine mandates on major American employers. In a majority decision, justices ruled that it was a clear case of executive overreach. What happened here in Canada? What is going on? The decision was a surprise to Canadians. There are a number of similar challenges that have failed. Time after time during the COVID-19 pandemic, Canadian governments imposed extraordinary public health measures that seem to be naked infringements on Canadian charter rights, mandated church closures to violate protections of freedom of religion, bans on gatherings that curbed freedom of association, border and travel strictures that undermined charter guarantees on mobility rights. But the courts didn't care. Whenever a pandemic case hit the docket courts, the courts erred too far on the side of deferring to government. Jonah Barron, the executive director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, sorry, I got the JCCF wrong at the beginning there, told the National Post, Sunday marks the 40th anniversary of Canada's repatriating its constitution, a process that included a passage of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Charter has often been praised as one of Canada's leading modern accomplishments and its gift to the world, but it's also one of the world's only constitutions that explicitly gives the state a roadmap on how to quash the very fundamental freedoms it cites. It's why 4 decades in, not everyone is inclined to cheer it as a bulwark of liberty. I cannot think of any freedom that the Charter has brought to us, said John Capre, president of the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, a group that has been particularly active in challenging pandemic mandates and defending the organizers of the Freedom Convoy. We are less free today than 40 years ago, he says. If governments are looking to do an end run around charter enumerated rights, there are two two primary sections of the document that they turn to. Section 1, which is literally the first line of the text of the charter that explicitly states the rights and freedoms are protected in Canada only to reasonable limits. According to an official document of the Canada Guide to Charter, the purpose of the section is to remind Canadians that, the purpose of the section is to remind Canadians that the rights can be limited by law so long as the limits can be shown to be reasonable in a free and democratic society. I'm not sure how they've demonstrated those in recent time. We've had challenges to this that they were not demonstrably reasonable limitations. According to Brian Peckford, who's actually currently in lawsuit with the federal government over, I believe it was travel restrictions that he challenged in a court case. The notwithstanding clause allows provincial governments to knowingly pass legislation that treads on fundamental freedom. If such legislative override had existed in the U.S. Constitution, many of the most iconic Supreme Court decisions of the civil rights movement might not have mattered. Brown versus Board of Education, the 1954 decision that struck down school segregation, could simply have been ignored by the states invoking the notwithstanding clause. Now, I'll leave a link to this in the description down below just to save from the video going too much longer, but definitely a good read, worthwhile. But I think it's important to hold people's feet to the fire, and we'll see as elections move forward who was supporting of the Emergencies Act. So again, I'll leave a link to this as well in the description down below so you can look through and see your representative and how they voted in that particular matter. Now, did it matter that the Emergencies Act passed? No, not really, because all the damage had been done by the time they actually voted on it. And then before it passed in the Senate or was stricken down in the Senate, which it looked like it may have gone that way, Justin Trudeau just revoked the Emergencies Act. So this is a clear case of government overreach and a violation of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that they proclaim to uphold and honor 40 years later. I'll leave you guys with that. Leave a comment in the comment section down below, and otherwise, we'll see you in the next video. Keep on trucking.